Chris Hensley is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer member of FINRA SIPC, investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and Houston First Financial Group are not affiliated.
The Houston Midtown chapter of the Society for Financial Awareness presents Money Matters with your host, Christopher Hensley.
Good morning, everybody. You're listening to Money Matters on KPFT Houston. The time is now 11 a.m. We've got a great show lined up for you today. To say that being an immigrant in Houston at this time is confusing is an understatement with what's going on right now with immigration here in the U.S. To become a citizen or to be an immigrant here in the United States and then have to deal with finances is a whole nother ballgame. It can be confusing. It can be daunting. We have with us today immigration attorney Adina Applebaum. She has the website immigrantfinance.com, and we'll be doing a deep dive into this topic. So please stay tuned. Keep listening. But if you are a longtime listener of Money Matters, you know we always reserve just the first few moments of the show to tell you what's going on in the Houston and the Gulf Coast area when it comes to financial literacy. So we do have a TRS talk at the Luskin Library on July 28th. That is free and open to the public, but it's dealing with teacher retirement system or the state pension for teachers or state employees who have the option of teacher retirement system or optional retirement program. That is going to be from 10 a.m. to noon on July 28th. At the Luskin Library, free, open to the public. July 16th at the Houston Independent School District, we were going to have an estate planning talk. Now, that one is actually closed to just HISD employees. And then also, again, on July 25th, back at HISD, we will be doing an investment basics talk, but that is closed just to HISD employees. With that, let's go ahead and get Adina on the line and maximize our time here with her. Adina, are you there?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I always kind of start the show the same way as I'll usually introduce listeners to you by sharing your bio. Now, you're an immigration attorney, a creative social entrepreneur, and the founder of Immigrant Finance, which is a personal finance site just for immigrants. For your immigration-related projects, you have been highlighted in the Forbes 30 Under 30 list and selected as a Fulbright Scholar and awarded an Equal Justice Works Fellowship. Adina, thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about immigration and money.
Absolutely. Well, before we get kicked off, would you be able to share something about yourself outside of the bio?
Sure. Well, I am from the D.C. area, and I've been doing immigration work for almost 10 years now. I've worked with refugees in the Middle East and in South America, and I've worked on the border of Texas and Mexico. I'm actually married to an immigrant, and it's just always been a part of my life. So I love meeting people from different cultures and celebrating the diversity that immigrants bring to society.
Well, maybe we should start with what is Immigrant Finance and how did that start?
So Immigrant Finance is an online website that is about personal finance just for immigrants. And there's a lot of factors that went into me starting this. I would say the main one is just being an immigration lawyer under this current administration and all the attacks on immigrants. It's become very, very difficult and negative, and I had been searching for a way for a while to make a more positive impact and way to empower immigrants in a different way. And separate from that, I've just personally been following personal finance blogs and podcasts for years to teach myself. I work at a nonprofit, and so does my husband. So we have always needed to try to learn to figure out how to manage money, and have found those resources really helpful. And I noticed there was nothing out there for immigrants. And just also my personal experience when my husband first moved here in 2013 to the U.S., we had to go through all of those steps of how he could learn to integrate with the U.S. financial system as a new immigrant. It was really, really scary and stressful and overwhelming, and there was nowhere to go to learn how to do it. And I'm even an immigration lawyer, and I didn't know what to do. We were constantly researching it and trying to figure out ourselves. We didn't know if he was allowed to open a bank account. He had never had a credit card before because in his country, people don't use credit really. So there was just a lot of stuff we had to figure out, and we would like to make it easier for other immigrants to not have to go through that whole process and just provide a more simple way to convey that information on one site.
Absolutely. Let's get a little bit more specific, because when you come to this country as an immigrant, it can be tough. There are unique problems that come along to just being introduced to what's going on with finances here in the U.S. Can you talk about some of those problems that are unique to immigrants?
Absolutely. I would say, one really big issue is a lot of immigrants have fear of the banks for good reason, because in most countries, the banks cannot be trusted. I know where my husband grew up, there was like 10 different presidents in 2 years when he was growing up, and the bankers took all the money and left the country, and a lot of people lost all their life savings. So there's a lot of fear, and I think it's important to help immigrants understand that it is a different situation here in the U.S. You can get a bank account that is what's called FDIC insured, which means that if there was a Great Depression or something and the banks lost all the money, the federal government would be able to give you back your money up to $250,000 in the account. So kind of just that money mindset of understanding it is different here, and that people are actually safer if they have bank accounts and aren't just keeping all of their savings in cash. If you have everything in cash, you're very vulnerable if you were going to get robbed or if someone took advantage of you. So engaging in the banking system and basic financial products can be a really great way to protect yourself against risk. And then one other thing that I think is particular to immigrants is a lot of people don't know that undocumented immigrants can get bank accounts and credit cards. And there's a whole process to go through that we cover on our website, how you can apply for something called an ITIN number, individual tax identification number, and that can be used in lieu of a social security number at many banks, for example.
So this is a lot of really good information. One of the benefits of here in Houston, we have a lot. We call what's called unbanked people who don't necessarily trust the banks as they come into the city. But one of the benefits is removing some of the risk. You talked about FDIC and insurance on accounts, and it's the opposite of what they're thinking. If they've come from a culture where they've seen the banks fail or they've had corruption at a level where you mentioned the multiple presidents and then the bankers essentially running off with the money. It's a different thing for what's here. There's also, I know in Houston, what's considered unbanked, the idea of a lot of times people will send money back home, and there are companies that will set up just to charge a gigantic fee to send money back home. Are you able to talk on that as well?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. There's not enough consumer finance education out there about how companies can take advantage of immigrants. honestly, there's even a lot of immigration lawyers that take advantage of immigrants or who say they're immigration lawyers, but they're not. There's a whole thing of notario fraud. And, it's important to educate yourself and look for options that are going to have the lowest fees. That applies for sending money back, and also for having bank accounts and credit cards. You want to get, for bank account, the lowest fee with the highest interest rate to make a little money off your savings. And for credit cards, you want to have the lowest interest rate and no fees if possible. But one other point I think that's important to talk about on sending money back home is that a lot of people, have very different pulling, pressures and goals when they're new immigrants in the U.S. because on one hand, you want to build some stability here so that you can stay and keep working and be able to feed yourself and have a roof over your head. But on the other hand, a lot of people have family back home or children or spouses or extended family who have a lot less than they do here. And there's a lot of pressure to send money back and a lot of desire because a lot of immigrants have amazing family values and want to be sharing what they make. But I think one principle that we've been focusing on a lot is that it's important to pay yourself first. And this idea of sustainability, if you can get yourself in a stable place and have a little bit of a savings fund for emergencies, then any emergency that comes up will throw you off and you will no longer be able to send money back home and help people at home. So you want to first get yourself in a stable place and have an emergency fund so you can weather those storms like a car accident or a medical emergency that could, throw you back for a few months or put you in debt. If you have some savings, it's easier to get over those bumps and be able to continue sending money back home.
So I love that. And one of the things you just mentioned was pay yourself first. It's the idea if you're putting your oxygen mask on first before helping others.
Exactly, yeah.
You have to make sure that you have a safe foundation before you're able to help, and then you're able to help even more. That is great advice. You mentioned earlier that undocumented people are able to get bank accounts, and I think some people out there's this myth that they're not able to do that. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, so there's, at least that I'm aware of, there's no law saying that undocumented immigrants can't have bank accounts, and there's nothing saying that banks have to ask you about your immigration status. It's more a matter of whether some banks are willing to take a risk on giving an account for someone who is undocumented. And there are a lot of major national banks that do allow people who don't have any immigration status to open a bank account. So the two main things you need if you're undocumented to open a bank account are one, an identification number, and two, an identification card. And it's definitely more difficult to show those if you're undocumented, but there's ways to get around it. So for the first one, for an identification number, people, who have green cards or who, maybe if they've won asylum, they can have social security numbers. And that's traditionally what banks accept for the identification number. But there's another option many other banks will accept for an individual tax identification number, or ITIN. And that's something you can get by paying taxes to the federal government. It's meant for foreign nationals who are making some kind of income in the U.S. And so that's an option to get an identification number that a lot of banks will accept. And then for the second requirement for identification cards, again, that's more complicated if you're undocumented because people who do have some kind of lawful immigration status might have a green card with their photo ID that they can use, or maybe they qualify to get a driver's license in the state they live that they could use. Or people can use, a passport that's unexpired. If you're undocumented, there are several cities in the U.S. that do provide identification cards for undocumented immigrants that you can just Google online and look up states or cities that have identification cards. Most of the major cities in the U.S. do allow that, like I believe L.A., New York, D.C., Chicago. So that can be a way to prove your identification card to show basically that you are who you're saying you are. And that should meet that requirement for many banks.
And if you are somebody who needs help in this area, we're talking today with the author of the website immigrantfinance.com, and you've actually got an article on here that kind of walks them through the steps of the different documentation needed and things that they will need to do. So we would point you back to that immigrantfinance.com to dive a little bit deeper into that. What would be, if you were going through a list of things that are important financially for someone to do who has arrived to the country, they're undocumented, and they're trying to get on their feet, what would be kind of your best tips, or where would you point them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of this comes from literally what I went through with my husband and helping him get set up. So the first thing I think is opening a bank account, because then you have a safe place to put your money. And it's, it's harder to spend your money when it's not all in front of you in cash, so it's easier to save. The second thing I would say is build an emergency fund. Another name people use for this is like a rainy day fund, but it's basically money put to the side that you don't use that is there only for emergencies. So if you lose your job or you have a medical emergency, it is there for you. And I think that is so, powerful just in terms of being able to weather the storms that we all go through, but also it mentally is really helpful because it gives you a sense of reassurance and comfort that you always know that's there. And it can take time to build, but even if you can just put away like $20 a month or something, that does add up over time. And sometimes you find when you're putting, even just something like 20, then the next month might be a little easier to put 50, and you get motivated as you see it growing. And by minimizing, that risk of emergencies, it also allows you to take more risk. So maybe, you don't like your job, and there's something else you want to be doing. You might have a little bit more flexibility to take a course, or get some kind of training you need to do the next job you want, knowing that you have that backup emergency fund in the meantime between jobs, for example, or to give you that comfort of making a change. So it allows you to take more risk, which can help you build wealth in the long run and help you have more money for you and your family, and for family back home that you want to send money to.
So those are two biggies: the opening the bank account, and then having that emergency fund, that safety net, that 3 to 6 months committed living expenses, a cushion in case something happens. But what you've also said, it's also referred to as the rainy day fund. But being able to have that safety, so that if you do take a little bit of risk, that you have something there to fall back on. What other things can you think of when it comes to finances that are a concern? I know credit, heck, even for people who are documented, because is an issue. What is your take on credit when it comes to being newly to the country?
Well, it's so funny because I was talking to someone who recently came here fleeing Venezuela, all the conflict going on there, and he said to me, "It's crazy. I don't even have any credit here, and all these people are trying to give me a car loan, and I've never had credit." So the point of me telling that story is, I think the main thing to learn about is that there is a big problem with credit in the U.S., and we have a culture of going into debt through credit cards that you want to be wary of and try to avoid. And the best way to do that is not getting involved in that from the start. So if you want to take a little time before using a credit card until you feel more on your feet, that's fine. But on the other hand, I think if you can learn good habits, how to manage a credit card well, it has a lot of benefits for immigrants. So something I learned growing up from my dad was just, pay off your credit card bill in full every month. If you do that every month, you never have to worry about credit card debt, and you live within your means because you can only buy what you can pay off, right? So I think that's a great strategy if you want to use a credit card. And, I should mention that the ITIN number I talked about with bank accounts can also be used for a lot of credit cards. So it is possible for immigrants without status or different kinds of status to apply for credit cards. just going to depend on the company and what they require for identification. And then I'll just add also on this point for credit cards that I think that the reason it can be really helpful for immigrants is just like a bank account. It can help you create what we call a paper trail in immigration law, which is like for, if you ever do have to go to immigration court, if you're ever applying for a green card or something in the future, for many types of immigration cases, you have to prove that you've been living in the U.S. for a certain amount of time, certain amount of days. And bank accounts and credit cards are a really great way to do that because you can show the date it was opened and the address, that you're living here, it's on file, and then, you'll have a record of every transaction you do over years. And that's often used to show people's presence in the U.S. for those types of things. So it can be really helpful.
So that's something that people might not think about, but when it comes to the immigration court, that if you're asked to provide a paper trail of documents that you are here, that you've got legitimate reasons here, I've got a bank account, I've got credit established, things that they may shy away from, but it would ultimately help in the end if they are asked to prove like a paper trail or something like that.
Yeah, and it also, back to the bank accounts and emergency fund, it can help you pay for an immigration lawyer if you need one. So a lot of people don't know that there's no public defender in immigration court. So most people are unrepresented and they have to represent themselves in immigration court. And only if they can pay for a lawyer or if they can find a nonprofit who will take their case will they be represented. And it's very expensive to hire a good immigration lawyer. And a lot of people can't do that because they can't afford it. So that's a great reason as well to have an emergency fund. People are, studies have shown can be 6 times more likely to win their case if they do have an immigration lawyer compared to if they don't.
So that makes sense. I know I've heard some stories as far as the nonprofits stepping up into the space with attorneys, but I imagine they're so backlogged with so many cases that it's hard to as that being an avenue. So then you're not going to get a public defender. You would need to establish some finances there to essentially self-fund your representation.
Exactly.
Well, outside of the bank accounts and the credit cards, what other things did you find out, or maybe have been roadblocks for you, your husband, or even clients as they've come into the country?
That's a great question. The next thing I usually talk about is about those roadblocks more like mentally. So kind of more in the realm of money mindset and financial goals, I think are the next big step that people have to grapple with. Like I mentioned before, that immigrants often have a lot of competing goals, like wanting to have stability here and have a roof over their head, wanting to send money home, maybe wanting to get an education, maybe wanting to get a medical procedure that they've been putting off for years. There's a lot of needs to spend money on. So sitting down and writing up like all of your financial goals, I recommend, and then going through them, really thinking about it, talking about it with your family, and deciding what are your top 1 or 2 goals for the next 6 months, for example. That's a great strategy because your goals are going to change. Your income may change, your opportunities may change. You might not be able to pursue certain goals 6 months from now if things get worse. You just never know. So you can at least set your goals right now for the near future for 6 months, and then check in every 6 months with those goals, reevaluate, see if there's something else that's more important. Your goal, you might have a short-term goal and a long-term goal. You might have a short-term goal that, like, I really miss my parents. I really want to see them, and I want to be able to pay for them to come visit me or for me to visit them or meet somewhere in the middle, for example. That might be a short-term goal. Compared to a long-term goal, it might be, building up an emergency fund or saving for retirement or saving to buy a house, things like that.
So all of these goals that you mentioned are very important. These have to do with the money mindset that you mentioned, and kind of having conflicting goals of wanting to send money back home, but then you've also got, you want to get an education, health care, but taking the time to write those goals down, whether they're short-term or long-term, but then also prioritizing what's most important in the next 6 months. What do I need to focus on? One of the things you mentioned was health care. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? I know for someone who's arriving in the U.S. who doesn't, what does health care look like for immigrants?
Yeah, that is a complicated area that is a little bit outside of my expertise, but from personal experience, seeing my husband go through it, he does not have benefits at his job. So we were, lucky enough to have the Obamacare get passed around the time he came, or a little after, and so he was able, not immediately. For a while he went without insurance, but about a year or two after living here, we were able to get him set up to get Obamacare through the state where we lived, and it was very expensive, and he did have to pay a large chunk of his salary to have that. But for him, that was something really important. He really wanted to have that in case any medical emergencies came up, and it was just one of his financial goals, really. For some people, it might matter less. At this point now, he didn't have dental insurance for a long time. Right now, he's able to get it through my work, where we pay to get dental insurance through my job. But, he went years without getting his teeth cleaned, and he would wait until he would go back home because it was a lot cheaper. And so it's been a big struggle. It's been a big part of what we've had to work through is the healthcare stuff. And I think it takes years to get that figured out and to have, the opportunity to be able to get healthcare. A lot of people don't get to have that and have to rely on going to the emergency room once things get really bad. I think something to avoid that is if you can find a clinic, like a minute clinic through CVS, for example, or something like that. That's a good way to try to avoid having to go to the emergency room and getting really high medical bills.
I know healthcare is another one of those hot button topics that, it's the elephant in the room. These are very volatile policies right now with what's going on with ACA and then also with the immigration status. And people will get, what's called compassion fatigue or basically just kind of burned out on all these changes. What would you tell somebody who wants to, make a difference when it comes to policy? Where does finance play a role in that?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I think that's where I got with starting immigrantfinance.com, because I was dealing with the same question. I mean, I work at a nonprofit in my day job, helping immigrants, and I love it, and it's great work, but there's only so much to do, and there's just so many attacks right now in the immigration community. So that's where I got to personal finance. But my answer to you is I think that it's actually really empowering to educate yourself and your friends and family about personal finance, because at the end of the day, this is very blunt, but immigrants who have more money are not the ones who get deported, is often what I see. So being able to build some stability and wealth through learning about personal finance and taking some of these steps and telling your friends and family about it can empower the entire community more, and get the community more to a place where, if we can vote, our vote matters more, or we can have more influence or hold, our politicians accountable. Money is power. So I think it's a really powerful way actually to make a difference and be able to stand up. It's a long-term strategy for sure, but I think the rewards are incredible.
Absolutely. Adina, we are right here bumping towards the end of the show. Is there something that you would like to tell our audience that I have forgot to ask you?
I would just say if you want to learn more about these topics, check out immigrantfinance.com. You can send us an email at hello@immigrantfinance.com.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Money Matters Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, visit us on the web at www.moneymatterspodcast.com. Drop us a line on SpeakPipe on the right-hand corner. It will receive any voicemails, questions, thoughts, concerns that you have about the show. In addition to this, we recently launched a Patreon campaign. Click on the Donate Now tab to hit the tip jar and find out what Patreon's campaign is all about.